On the day he is summoned to perfume a vizier's court, the city's finest nose uncorks his masterpiece, and the hall fills with roasted flesh, as if Al-Aleem has turned his body into a walking grave. The year was 255 of the Hijra, and the great round city of Baghdad was sweltering under a heat so heavy it felt like a wet wool blanket pressed against the face of the world. While the poets and scholars sat in the cool marble courtyards of the House of Wisdom debating philosophy under the stars, a very different kind of chemistry was brewing in the suffocating bowels of the Kark district. Here, the air did not smell of ink and parchment but of rancid fat, boiling rosewater, and the sharp, metallic tang of copper. This was the domain of Al-Jais, a man whose nose was said to be so sensitive he could smell a lie before it left a man's lips, yet he remained blissfully blind to the rot festering in his own soul. He was a master perfumer, yes, but he was also a man consumed by a hunger that no meal could satisfy, a green-eyed envy that had turned his blood into vinegar. His target was not gold or jewels, but a scrap of parchment, a secret formula for a musk so pure and enduring that it was rumored to have been distilled from the sweat of the Houris in paradise. And the only thing standing between Al-Jais and this liquid immortality was a humble, pious man named Yusuf. Yusuf was everything Al-Jais was not: kind, charitable, and maddeningly devout. He held the recipe not for profit, but as a sacred trust passed down through 3 generations, refusing to sell it even for 10,000 dinars. On this particularly breathless night, when the humidity from the Tigris River turned the alleyways into a steam bath, Al-Jais had finally lured Yusuf into his subterranean laboratory under the guise of a collaborative experiment. The laboratory was a windowless dungeon of sensory overload, lined with shelves of glass vials that glinted like the eyes of watching jinns in the flickering lamplight. Huge copper stills hissed and groaned like dying beasts, filling the room with a fog of jasmine and ambergris that was so thick it coated the back of the throat with a sickly sweetness. Al-Jais watched Yusuf lean over a mortar, his neck exposed, his trust absolute, and felt a surge of adrenaline that was sharper than any drug. The envy that had simmered for 10 years boiled over in a single heartbeat. Al-Jais reached out, his hand trembling not with fear but with a terrible anticipation, and wrapped his fingers around the handle of a heavy bronze pestle. It was a tool of creation, used to grind spices and flowers into beauty, but in the hands of a desperate man, it became an instrument of destruction. He moved with the silence of a viper. There was no hesitation, no cinematic pause for a monologue, just the brutal, dull thud of bronze colliding with the base of the skull. The sound was sickeningly organic, a wet crunch that echoed off the cold stone walls and seemed to hang in the perfumed air long after the blow landed. Yusuf crumpled without a cry, dropping like a sack of grain, his head striking the stone floor with a finality that made the glass vials rattle on their shelves. Blood began to pool on the limestone, dark and glossy like spilled pomegranate syrup, moving with a disturbing swiftness toward the drains. Al-Jais stood over him, breathing hard, the pestle dripping in his hand, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He waited for the silence to return, for the deed to be done, but the silence was broken. Yusuf was not dead, not yet. His body convulsed, a spasm of nerves firing in the dark, and he turned his head, his eyes struggling to focus through the veil of death. He did not look at the weapon, nor at the man who had been his friend. He looked up at the ceiling, or perhaps through it, to something Al-Jais could not see. With his final breath, a red bubble bursting on his lips, he whispered a sentence that would haunt the darkness of that cellar forever. He did not beg for mercy, and he did not curse his killer. He simply wheezed, "You may hide this deed from the magistrate, Al-Jais, you may bury me deep, but you cannot hide from Al-Aleem." Then the light faded from his eyes, leaving Al-Jais alone with the hissing stills and the all-knowing witness that now filled every shadow in the room. Al-Jais stared down at the corpse of the man who had been his brother in trade, his chest heaving like a bellows, and for a fleeting moment, the weight of the dead man's final sentence seemed to press harder upon the room than the stone ceiling itself. Al-Aleem. The All-Knowing. It was a name that should have struck terror into the heart of any believer, a reminder that the darkness has eyes and the silence has a memory, but Al-Jais was a man of science, of distillation and extraction, and he had long ago decided that the only judgment that mattered was the one passed by men with swords and chains. He spat on the floor, right next to Yusuf's cooling hand, a glob of saliva mixing with the dust to signify his absolute rejection of the divine threat. To him, Yusuf was no longer a rival or a vessel of sacred knowledge, he was merely organic matter, a complication of flesh and bone that needed to be transmuted into something formless and silent. The perfumer wiped the sweat from his brow with a bloody sleeve and turned his gaze toward the great furnace that dominated the far wall of the cellar. It was a monstrous thing of black iron and firebrick, usually reserved for the high heat extraction of stubborn resins, but tonight, it would serve a far darker purpose. He dragged the body across the limestone floor, the expensive silk of Yusuf's robes snagging on the rough stones, making a sound like whispering conspirators. It took every ounce of strength in his sinewy arms to hoist the dead weight into the maw of the furnace, shoving the limbs inside with a frantic, jerky violence until the heavy iron door clanged shut, sealing the atrocity within. Al-Jaiz did not hesitate, he stoked the fire with a manic energy, feeding it dried palm fronds, charcoal, and logs of dense olive wood until the iron began to glow a dull, malevolent red. The roar of the flames grew deafening, drowning out the noises of the waking city above, a hungry, rushing sound that vibrated through the soles of his sandals. But then came the smell. It was not the sweet smoke of oud or sandalwood, it was the thick, cloying stench of singed hair and roasting meat, a primal odor that triggered a retching instinct deep in his gut. Panic flared in his chest. If this smell escaped into the street, the night watch would be at his door in 5 minutes. Thinking quickly, he raided his own shelves, grabbing handfuls of frankincense, lumps of precious myrrh, and dried bundles of sage, tossing them into the vents and directly onto the fire. The cellar filled with a chaotic, suffocating fog of holy incense warring with the stench of death, a olfactory blasphemy that would have made an angel weep. For 3 long hours, Al-Jaiz tended his hellish creation, pacing the small room like a caged tiger, watching the temperature gauge, ensuring the heat was sufficient to reduce bone to ash. When the fire finally died down and the iron cooled enough to touch, he opened the door to find that the fire had done its work with terrifying efficiency. Yusuf was gone. In his place lay a pile of grey dust and charred fragments, resting in a pool of strange, dark grease that shimmered with a metallic sheen under the lantern light. Al-Jaiz did not recoil, instead, he felt a surge of cold, clinical triumph. He took a shovel and scooped the remains, ash, bone fragments, and the dark residue, into a large mixing trough he used for clay. He was currently in the process of expanding the cellar to store more oil, and a pile of sand and unmixed lime sat in the corner. A macabre inspiration seized him, a way to ensure that Yusuf would never be found, not by the caliph's guards and not by any inquisitive relatives. He poured water into the trough, mixing the lime and sand with the ashes of his victim, the shovel scraping against the stone with a rhythmic, grinding rasp. The mortar turned a peculiar, dark gray, speckled with the white grit of calcified bone, a mixture that was stronger and heavier than any he had made before. With the trowel in his hand, Al-Jaiz began to lay the bricks for the new retaining wall, working with a feverish precision. Slap, scrape, stack. Slap, scrape, stack. Each brick was cemented in place with the literal remains of the man he had murdered, sealing Yusuf into the very foundation of the house. He worked until his muscles burned and his fingers were raw, building a barrier that was 3 feet thick and perfectly smooth. As he smoothed the final layer of mortar over the face of the wall, hiding the last traces of the dark gray mixture, he stepped back to admire his handiwork. It was a masterpiece of concealment. The wall looked innocent, mundane, just another part of the architecture, silent and strong. He then turned his attention to the floor, scrubbing the limestone with gallons of vinegar and strong lye, scouring away the blood until the stone was bleached white and smelled only of sharp chemicals. He burned the cleaning rags in the last embers of the furnace and washed his own body with rosewater, scrubbing until his skin was pink and raw. By the time the muezzin's call to the far prayer drifted down from the minarets, echoing through the cool morning air, Al-Jaiz was standing in a spotless room. There was no body. There was no weapon. There was no blood. He looked at the new wall, solid and impenetrable, and a smile curled his lips. He had done it. He had defeated the world, he had defeated the law, and as he climbed the stairs to his bedchamber to sleep the sleep of the just, he was certain he had even defeated the unseen eyes of the divine. The seasons turned over the city of Baghdad like the pages of a great book, and the waters of the Tigris swelled and receded 3 times, marking the passage of 3 full years since that night of blood and fire. Where once there had been fear and the frantic beating of a guilty heart, there was now only the golden silence of prosperity and the heavy, satisfying clink of dinars. Al-Jaiz had not merely survived his crime, he had flourished upon its ashes, rising like a phoenix fed on the flesh of his rival. With Yusuf gone, the market for the finest essences had fallen entirely into his grasping hands, and he had wasted no time in capitalizing on the void. He had found the parchment, the sacred recipe Yusuf had died to protect, hidden within the lining of the dead man's sash before it was consumed by the furnace, and he had brewed the musk with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. He called it the breath of dawn, a scent so intoxicating, so complex and layered with notes of dark oud, wild rose, and the heavy, animalistic warmth of pure deer musk, that it was said to make weeping men laugh and angry men forget their quarrels. It was a lie, of course, a stolen masterpiece presented as his own invention, but the people of Baghdad did not care for the provenance, only the pleasure. The vials sold for 50 dinars apiece, then 100, then 200, until owning a bottle of Al-Jaiz's perfume became a mark of status that rivaled the possession of a ruby or a sapphire. His ascent was meteoric, a vertical climb that took him from the dusty, crowded stalls of the lower souk to the marble-floored antechambers of the Caliph's palace. He became the perfumer to the elite, the nose of the court, summoned to scent the veils of the princesses and to fumigate the beard of the Grand Vizier himself. He walked the streets now not as a tradesman, but as a minor deity of commerce, clad in robes of iridescent silk imported from the far reaches of China, his fingers heavy with rings of silver and carnelian. The common folk parted before him like the Red Sea, bowing their heads in deference to the man who smelled of heaven, unaware that the scent masking his skin was bought with the blood of a righteous man. Al-Jaiz reveled in this adoration, his chest swelling with a pride that left no room for remorse. He had rewritten the narrative of his life, editing out the ugly chapter of the murder with the ink of his success. In his mind, Yusuf was no longer a victim, he was merely a stepping stone, a necessary sacrifice on the altar of Al-Jaiz's destiny. The memory of the crunch of bone and the hiss of the furnace had faded, bleached away by the relentless sun of his good fortune, until it was nothing more than a vague, bad dream that he could dismiss with a wave of his perfumed hand. His home, once a modest dwelling above a damp cellar, had been transformed into a palace of sensory delights. He had purchased the neighboring properties, knocking down walls and raising ceilings, filling the courtyards with fountains that splashed water scented with orange blossom. But it was the cellar, the site of the great transmutation, that received the most peculiar attention. Al-Jaiz did not seal it off, instead, he turned it into his private treasury, a sanctum where he kept his most precious oils and the chests of gold that he could not bear to send to the money changers. He walked down those stone steps every day, his sandals slapping against the limestone he had scrubbed so clean, and he looked at the wall. The wall was his masterpiece, the silent guardian of his secret. To the unknowing eye, it was simply a retaining wall, necessary for the structural integrity of the expanded house. But to Al-Jaiz, it was a tomb, a reliquary, and a trophy. He had covered the rough stone with magnificent tapestries woven in the mountains of Persia, depicting hunting scenes where lions took down gazelles, a fitting metaphor, he thought, for his own triumph. The heavy wool and silk hung floor to ceiling, obscuring the grey mortar and the bone ash hidden within. He would stand before it, sipping wine from a crystal goblet, and toast the silence. "You are quiet now, my friend," he would whisper to the tapestry, a smirk playing on his lips. "The magistrate has not come. The guards have not come. And your God? He seems to be looking the other way." The arrogance of the man was absolute, a fortress built of ego that he believed was impregnable. He had ceased to fear the name Al-Aleem, it was just a word, a sound made by dying men, powerless against the reality of gold and influence. He attended the Friday prayers at the great mosque, bowing his head in false piety, his forehead touching the prayer mat while his mind calculated the profits of the coming week. He felt no heat from the stones, no tremor in the earth. He believed he had cheated the cosmic balance, that he had committed the perfect crime, a sin without a consequence, a debt that would never be called in. He slept the deep, dreamless sleep of the soulless, surrounded by soft cushions and the lullaby of the night wind, secure in the knowledge that the only witness to his deed was a pile of dust trapped forever in the dark, silent embrace of lime and sand. He did not know, could not know, that the wall was not merely a tomb, but an incubator. He did not understand that silence is not always emptiness. Sometimes, silence is a breath being held, a pressure building in the dark, waiting for the precise, destined moment to exhale. The wealth, the silk, the praise of the caliph, it was all a facade, a glittering curtain drawn over a rotting wound that had never truly healed. And as the third year drew to a close, and the heat of the summer began to bake the city once more, the air in the cellar began to change, imperceptibly at first, a shifting of atoms that no amount of rosewater could suppress. But for now, Al-Jaiz stood at the pinnacle of his world, a king of sense, unaware that the ground beneath his feet was hollow and that the wall behind the tapestry was beginning to remember what it held. But the scales of the Almighty are not balanced by gold, and the memory of the earth is not erased by the passage of suns or moons. It was in the height of the fourth summer following the deed, when the heat lay upon Baghdad like a physical weight, that the first thread of Al-Jaiz's tapestry began to unravel. It did not begin with a thunderclap or a vision of avenging angels, for the all-knowing is subtle in his ways, choosing to pierce the veil of arrogance with a needle rather than a sword. The day had begun with a triumph, an invitation to the summer palace of the vizier, a man of immense power and fastidious tastes who had commissioned Al-Jaiz to create a fragrance that would capture the essence of a moonlit garden. Al-Jaiz had spent 3 months perfecting the blend, a delicate marriage of white jasmine, crushed pearls, and the rarest sandalwood brought by caravan from the fever jungles of the east. He had bathed himself that morning in water infused with cucumber and mint to close his pores against the heat, donned a robe of blinding white linen embroidered with silver thread, and anointed his beard with the very creation he intended to present. He felt clean, he felt holy in his own estimation, and as he stepped into his palanquin to be carried through the sweltering streets, he breathed in the scent of his own success, convinced that he was the master of the elements. However, as the palanquin swayed through the crowded marketplace, rocking gently on the shoulders of his servants, a strange and discordant note intruded upon his olfactory perfection. At first, it was faint, a mere ghost of a scent that drifted in and out of his awareness like a gnat buzzing near the ear. It was a smell he knew, a smell that had been locked away in the deepest dungeons of his memory, the distinct, sharp odor of singed hair and roasting meat. Al-Jaiz frowned, leaning out through the silk curtains of the litter to chastise his bearers, assuming they had walked too close to a tanner's yard or a butcher burning offal in the street. But the street was clear of such trades, there were only fabric merchants and sellers of spices. He sat back, dismissing it as a momentary pollution of the city air, a drift of smoke from a distant kitchen fire caught in a downdraft. Yet, as the journey continued, the smell did not dissipate. Instead, it seemed to coalesce, growing heavier and more distinct, clinging to the inside of the palanquin like a damp fog. It was not merely the smell of cooking, it was something older, something wrong, a thick, greasy stench that tasted of copper and carbonized bone. It sat at the back of his throat, coating his tongue with a phantom residue that made the delicate jasmine of his perfume taste like ash. By the time he arrived at the vizier's palace, Al-Jaiz was sweating profusely, not from the heat, but from a creeping, insidious anxiety that prickled at the base of his neck. He stepped out onto the cool marble of the courtyard, hoping the fresh air of the river would cleanse his senses, but the smell followed him. It was as if he were walking in a bubble of foul air, a personal miasma that moved when he moved and stopped when he stopped. He checked the soles of his expensive sandals, fearing he had stepped in the filth of a stray dog, but the leather was pristine. He sniffed his sleeves, his hands, the hem of his robe. To his horror, the scent seemed to be emanating from the linen itself, or perhaps from the skin beneath it. It was faint, he told himself, surely too faint for others to notice, a trick of the mind brought on by the oppressive humidity and the stress of the presentation. He forced a smile onto his face, smoothed his beard, and marched into the great hall where the vizier and his guests waited, reclining on cushions of velvet and silk, surrounded by bowls of sherbet and platters of fruit. The presentation began well enough. Al-Jaiz uncorked the crystal phial, and the guests leaned in, expecting the heavenly aroma of the moonlit garden. But as the first drop touched the skin of the vizier's wrist, the air in the room seemed to curdle. The jasmine and sandalwood were there, yes, but they were instantly undercut by a wave of something truly revolting, a stench so sharp and visceral that it made the eyes water. It was the smell of the furnace. It was the smell of the cellar on that night 3 years ago, magnified and distorted. The vizier recoiled, jerking his hand back as if he had been burned, his nose wrinkling in undisguised disgust. A murmur went through the assembly, the rustle of silk as bodies shifted away, the snapping of fans as ladies tried to waft away the sudden intrusion of corruption. "What is this?" the vizier demanded, his voice icy with offense, wiping his wrist frantically with a napkin. "Do you mock me, Al-Jaiz? You bring me a perfume that smells of a charnel house? Of burning refuse?" Al-Jaiz stood frozen, the blood draining from his face, leaving him pale and trembling. "My lord, it is the heat, a mistake in the mixture." He stammered, but the excuse died in his throat because he could smell it too, stronger now than ever. It was pouring off him, rolling off his body in waves of heat, a suffocating blanket of death stench that drowned out the flowers and the incense of the court. He looked around the room and saw the faces of the elite, faces that had once looked at him with adoration, now twisted in revulsion and judgment. He saw a young woman cover her mouth and gag, he saw a guard step forward, hand on the hilt of his sword, as if the smell itself were an assault. The shame was a physical blow, a hot iron branded onto his pride. He was the master of sense, the architect of beauty, and now he stood in the center of the most refined court in Baghdad smelling like a grave robber who had fallen into a fire. He fled. He did not ask for permission to leave, he simply turned and ran, his sandals slapping against the marble, the laughter and angry shouts of the courtiers chasing him like a pack of hounds. He threw himself into his palanquin and screamed at his bearers to run, to take him home, to hide him from the sun. The journey back was a descent into madness. The small, enclosed space of the litter became a gas chamber of his own making. The smell was no longer external, it was weeping from his pores, a toxic sweat that smelled of guilt and ancient grease. He clawed at his chest, tearing the expensive linen, gasping for air that was not tainted, but there was no escape because the source was his own flesh. The all-knowing had marked him. The secret he had buried behind the wall was no longer content to stay in the dark, it was rising to the surface, bubbling up through the layers of his lies to announce itself to the world. When he finally burst through the doors of his own home, he was a wild thing, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his fine clothes stained with sweat and the dust of his flight. He terrified his servants, screaming for water, for lye, for pumice stones. He ran to the bathhouse, stripping off his clothes and throwing them into the corner where they lay like a heap of rotting garbage. He scrubbed himself with a violence that bordered on self-mutilation. He used soap made of harsh olive oil and laurel, he used rough sponges, he used sand. He scrubbed until his skin was raw and bleeding, until the water in the basin turned pink with his own blood. "Out! Get it out!" he shrieked, his voice cracking, echoing off the tiled walls. For a moment, as he sat shivering in the cooling water, the smell seemed to recede, masked by the scent of raw soap and iron-rich blood. He closed his eyes, praying to a God he had ignored for years, begging for this affliction to be a passing sickness, a fever of the body and not the soul. But as he stepped out of the bath and reached for a towel, the air shifted again. It started slowly, a tendril of smoke curling around his ankles, invisible but undeniable. Then it rose, clinging to his damp skin, heavier than before. It was the smell of the mixing trough. It was the smell of the lime and the ash. It was the smell of Yusuf. Al-Jaiz fell to his knees, naked and shivering, realizing with a dawn of absolute horror that the smell was not just on him, it was in the house. It was in the walls. It was in the very air he breathed. He crawled out of the bathhouse, leaving bloody handprints on the floor, and dragged himself into the hallway. The servants were gone, the house was silent, save for the buzzing of flies that had seemingly manifested from nowhere. He followed the scent, his nose twitching like an animal's, led by an invisible cord that pulled him inexorably downward. It pulled him past the fountains that now smelled of stagnant water, past the kitchen that smelled of decay, to the heavy oak door that led to the cellar. He opened the door, and the smell hit him like a physical blow, a wall of hot, rancid air that rushed up the stairs to meet him. It was thick, palpable, a presence that almost had a voice. Al-Jaiz gagged, covering his mouth with his hand, but he could not stop himself. He descended the stairs, his naked feet cold on the stone, moving into the belly of the beast. The laboratory was dark, lit only by the faint light filtering down from the hallway, but he did not need eyes to see. The smell was emanating from the far end of the room, from behind the great Persian tapestry depicting the lion and the gazelle. He walked towards it, his legs shaking, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached out a trembling hand and gripped the edge of the heavy fabric. The wool felt hot to the touch, unnaturally warm, as if a fire were burning just on the other side. With a cry of despair that was half sob and half scream, he ripped the tapestry down, the metal rings clattering onto the floor like the coins of a traitor. There stood the wall. The wall he had built with his own hands. The wall that hid the ash. But it was no longer the gray, silent surface he had left 3 years ago. The mortar was weeping. A black, oily substance was oozing from the spaces between the stones, trickling down like black tears, and from this weeping stone pulsed the heat and the stench of the murder, fresh and raw, as if the fire had never gone out. Al-Aleem was speaking, and the house of lies was beginning to scream. The sun rose over Baghdad like a blister on the skin of the sky, casting a pale, sickly light upon a house that had become a tomb for the living. The servants had fled in the night, stealing away like shadows before the dawn, taking with them silver spoons and linen sheets, but leaving behind the heavy, suffocating terror that had taken root in the foundations. They whispered in the marketplace of a jinn, of a curse, of a smell that clung to the soul and could not be washed away, leaving Al-Jaiz alone in his sprawling mansion, a king ruling over an empire of dust and silence. He had barred the doors with heavy beams of oak and nailed shut the shutters of the windows, sealing himself inside a sarcophagus of his own making, terrified that the city watch or the nose of a passing magistrate might catch the scent of his guilt. But the isolation brought no relief, it only concentrated the horror. The air in the house was stagnant, hot, and heavy, recirculating the miasma of the cellar until the atmosphere itself felt gelatinous, coating the lungs with a film of grease with every desperate breath. Al-Jaiz moved through the darkened corridors like a spectre, his fine robes discarded for a simple loincloth, his body gaunt and wasted, the skin stretching tight over his ribs as if he were being consumed from the inside out. He had not eaten in 3 days. The very sight of food, of roasted lamb or spiced rice, triggered violent spasms of nausea, for the smell of the meat was indistinguishable from the smell of Yusuf. Even the water in the clay jars tasted of ash and lime, forcing him to drink sparingly, his lips cracked and bleeding, his tongue swollen in a mouth that tasted of copper and ruin. He began a frantic, delirious war against the invisible enemy, a campaign of olfactory violence waged within the confines of his own home. He raided his storerooms, dragging crates of precious resins and jars of rare oils into the central courtyard. He built pyres of sandalwood and agarwood, worth thousands of dinars, and set them ablaze, hoping to drown the stench of death in a flood of holy smoke. He smashed amphorae of rosewater against the tiled walls, shattering the clay and letting the expensive liquid pool on the floors, splashing it frantically over the furniture, the curtains, and his own wretched body. The house filled with a cacophony of scents, a chaotic, suffocating fog of jasmine, musk, frankincense, and myrrh, swirling in the heat like the breath of a dragon. But it was all in vain. The perfumes did not mask the rot, they curdled with it, twisting into something monstrous and unfamiliar, a sickly sweet stench of decay that was far worse than the smell of the corpse alone. It was the smell of a funeral parlor in high summer, the scent of flowers trying and failing to hide the reality of decomposition. Al-Jaiz gagged and retched, crawling across the floor on his hands and knees, his eyes streaming with tears caused by the acrid smoke, his mind fracturing under the assault. He could hear Yusuf now, or thought he could, a low, rhythmic scraping sound coming from beneath the floorboards, the sound of bone grinding against stone, the sound of a man trying to dig himself out of a shallow grave. "Quiet," he screamed at the empty room, his voice a raw, jagged thing. "Be quiet. I paid for your silence. I paid with the wall. I paid with the lime." But the house did not answer, save for the buzzing of 1,000 invisible flies that seemed to nest inside his own ears. Driven by a madness that was as clear and sharp as a diamond, Al-Jaiz realized that there was only one solution left. He could not hide the smell, he had to excise the source. He had to go back to the beginning, to the root of the cancer. He had convinced himself, in the twisted logic of his delirium, that the chemistry of the mortar had failed, that the lime had not consumed the flesh but had preserved it, allowing the humors of the dead man to leak into the stone. He believed that if he could just retrieve the remains, if he could scrape the bones from the wall and cast them into the Tigris, the spell would be broken. The river would wash Yusuf away, take him down to the Gulf and into the great ocean, and Al-Jaiz would be clean again. He would be free. Possessed by this new purpose, a manic energy surged through his wasted limbs. He stumbled to the garden shed, his hands shaking so violently he could barely work the latch, and retrieved a heavy iron sledgehammer, a tool used for breaking rocks for the foundation. The handle was rough, splintered wood, and the head was a solid block of black iron, scarred from years of labor. It was heavy, impossibly heavy for a starving man, but Al-Jaiz dragged it behind him, the metal head scraping a furrow in the expensive rugs as he made his way back to the door of the cellar. He stood at the top of the stairs, looking down into the abyss. The darkness below seemed to be breathing, inhaling and exhaling a draft of hot, fetid air that smelled of wet wool and burning fat. He descended, step by agonized step, the sledgehammer thumping against the stairs behind him like the footfalls of a pursuing giant. When he reached the bottom, the scene that greeted him was a vision from the lowest circle of hell. The laboratory was bathed in a dim, reddish light, though he had lit no lamps. Perhaps it was a trick of his bleeding eyes, or perhaps the furnace itself retained a ghostly memory of the fire. The wall, the great, smooth wall he had built with such pride, was hideous to behold. The black ooze he had seen earlier had spread, covering the masonry in a glistening, viscous web that looked like the veins of a necrotic limb. The smell here was physical, a solid thing that pushed against him, trying to force him back, trying to protect the secret within. Al-Jaiz stepped into the pool of rosewater and vinegar he had spilled days before, his feet slipping on the wet stone, and raised the hammer. He was weeping now, hot tears of frustration and terror cutting tracks through the grime on his face. "I will unmake you," he whispered to the wall, his voice trembling. "I made you, and I will unmake you. You cannot keep him. He is mine to dispose of." He swung the hammer. The blow was clumsy, fueled by desperation rather than strength, but the iron head struck the center of the wall with a thunderous crash that shook the very foundations of the house. Sparks flew as metal met stone, and a spiderweb of cracks appeared in the dark, weeping mortar. A chip of stone flew off and cut his cheek, but Al-Jaiz did not feel it. He swung again, and again, finding a rhythm in the violence, a chant of destruction. Clang! 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 With every blow, he grunted, a primal sound of exertion, channeling all his fear, all his envy, all his guilt into the swing of the hammer. The wall fought back, the stones were hard, the mortar seasoned and tough, reinforced with the very ash he sought to liberate. The shock of the impacts vibrated up his arms, rattling his teeth, jarring his bones, but he did not stop. He was a man possessed, a demon of demolition working to destroy the monument of his own sin. The cracks widened. Chunks of masonry began to fall, clattering to the floor, splashing into the foul liquid that pooled there. Dust rose in choking clouds, mixing with the humidity to form a gray paste that coated his skin and filled his nose, but he welcomed it. The dust was progress. The dust was the enemy yielding. For hours he worked, or perhaps it was minutes. Time had no meaning in the dark belly of the cellar. His hands were blistered and bloody, the skin torn away by the rough wood of the handle, his blood mixing with the sweat and the grime to turn the handle slick and red. His breath came in ragged, wheezing gasps, his heart hammering against his ribs like a bird trapped in a cage, fluttering wildly, skipping beats, threatening to burst. But he could see it now, the core of the wall. He had breached the outer layer of bricks and was hacking into the thick, concrete-like fill where he had dumped the mixture of lime and ash. He swung harder, screaming with every impact, a wordless howl of rage against the heavens. "Where are you?" he shrieked, striking the jagged hole he had made. "Show yourself. Give me the bones. Give me the ash." He dropped the hammer, its weight finally too much for his trembling arms, and fell to his knees before the breach. He clawed at the broken stones with his bare hands, tearing his fingernails, ignoring the pain, digging like a dog unearthing a bone. He grabbed handfuls of the gray rubble, bringing them close to his face, frantically searching for a fragment of white bone, a tooth, a piece of the skull, anything that proved Yusuf was there, that Yusuf was real, that this was a problem of matter and physics and not a judgment of the soul. But there was nothing. Just stone and mortar. He dug deeper, thrusting his arm into the hole up to the elbow, scraping his skin raw against the jagged edges of the bricks, feeling around in the dark cavity he had created. He expected to feel the soft, powdery drift of ash, he expected to touch the charred remnants of the ribcage. He found only emptiness. The space behind the bricks was solid, dense, and unnaturally cold. He pulled his arm back and grabbed the hammer again, fueled by a fresh wave of panic. He had to go deeper. Maybe he had missed the spot. Maybe the mixture had settled. He struck the wall again, a wild, flailing blow that knocked a massive section of the masonry loose. The stones tumbled away, crashing onto his legs, pinning him for a moment before he kicked them aside. The hole was now large enough for a man to crawl through, a gaping wound in the side of the cellar. Al-Jaiz stood panting, staring into the breach, waiting for the avalanche of ash, waiting for the smell to intensify, to reach a crescendo of rot that would finally kill him. And then, the impossible happened. As the final, large keystone crumbled away, revealing the deepest recess of the niche, the air in the room shifted instantly. It was not a gradual fading, it was a sudden, violent cessation. The cloying, suffocating stench of burning flesh and ancient grease simply vanished. It was snapped out of existence, as if a candle had been blown out in a gale. 1 second, the room was a poisonous gas chamber, the next, it was completely, utterly void of the scent. Al-Jaiz froze, his lungs heaving, his senses reeling from the sudden absence of the assault. He blinked, confused, the hammer slipping from his numb fingers to clang against the floor. He drew in a breath, expecting the foul taste, but instead, he was hit by a blast of air from the hole he had just made. But it was not the stagnant air of a cellar. It was a wind. A strong, steady current of air that rushed out from the solid earth, blowing the dust from his face, cooling the sweat on his brow. And it carried a scent. It was not the smell of death. It was not the smell of the river or the city. It was a smell that Al-Jaiz had not encountered since his childhood, a smell that belonged to the high mountains of Persia or the deep, untouched valleys of the Hijaz. It was the smell of absolute purity. It smelled of deep, frozen earth, of snow melting on black rock, of ozone after a thunderstorm, and underneath it all, a faint, heartbreakingly beautiful note of the finest deer musk, the very scent he had killed to possess, but pure, untainted by human hands, holy and wild. The wind roared from the hole, whipping his long, matted hair around his face, chilling him to the bone, blowing out the few sputtering lamps he had lit in the hallway above, plunging the house into total darkness. Al-Jaiz stood in the dark, the cold wind blasting against him, and he realized with a terror that stopped his heart cold that the wall had not been hiding a body. The wall had been a door. And he, in his arrogance and his madness, had just knocked it down. He fell backward, scrambling away from the breach on his hands and feet like a crab, his back hitting the opposite wall, his eyes wide and staring into the pitch black, waiting for whatever was riding that cold, holy wind to step into the room. The dawn broke over the city of Baghdad not with the golden promise of a new day, but with the grey, sickly pallor of a shroud being drawn across the face of the dead. The sun, usually a hammer that beat the city into submission, seemed hesitant to rise, hanging low and pale above the horizon as if reluctant to illuminate the horrors that the night had wrought. In the street of the perfumers, a heavy, unnatural silence had fallen, a silence so profound that it pressed against the eardrums of the neighbors more painfully than the screaming that had echoed through the alleyways only hours before. The neighbors, simple merchants and weavers who feared the evil eye as much as the tax collector, had gathered in a hushed knot outside the great carved doors of Al-Jaiz's mansion. They spoke in whispers, clutching their amulets, their eyes darting toward the silent windows where the shutters hung askew like broken eyelids. They had heard the sounds of destruction, the smashing of glass, the dull thuds of the sledgehammer, and finally, that terrible, soul-shredding shriek that had been cut off as abruptly as a cord snapped by a knife. Fear had kept them in their beds while the moon was high, but curiosity, that most fatal of human flaws, had drawn them out with the sun. They stood back when the heavy boots of the shurta, the city watch, rang out on the cobblestones. The captain of the watch, a man named Tariq whose face was a map of old scars and whose beard was dusted with the grey of 50 harsh winters, pushed through the crowd with the weary authority of a man who has seen every variety of human sin. He did not knock. The silence from within was answer enough. With a nod to his lieutenant, a burly giant carrying an iron-shod ram, they struck the timber. The door, barred from the inside by a master paralyzed by paranoia, held for 3 blows before the wood splintered with a sound like a cracking bone, and the lock gave way. The doors swung inward, groaning on dry hinges, and the watch stepped into the gloom. They expected the smell. The rumors of the rotting house had spread through the quarter, tales of a stench so foul it could curdle milk in the udder. But as Captain Tariq crossed the threshold, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword, he was met not by the odor of decay, but by a strange, sterile chill. The air in the courtyard was unnaturally cold, sharp and biting like the wind from a mountain peak, carrying a scent that was at once terrifyingly pure and utterly alien to the damp heat of the river city. It smelled of ozone, of lightning striking dry earth, and of a musk so deep and ancient it felt like a vibration in the chest rather than a smell in the nose. The courtyard itself was a scene of devastation that suggested the rampage of a wild beast. Precious amphorae lay shattered on the mosaic tiles, their contents spilled in dark, sticky pools that had not dried. The pyres of sandalwood Al-Jaiz had built were scattered, the charred logs kicked across the floor, leaving streaks of black soot on the white marble. Tapestries worth a prince's ransom had been torn from the walls and shredded, lying in heaps like the skin of flayed animals. But there was no sign of the master of the house. "Search the rooms," Tariq commanded, his voice sounding flat and small in the echoing space. "But touch nothing. There is a heaviness here." The guards fanned out, their leather armor creaking, their torches casting long, jumping shadows that seemed to dance with a life of their own. They found the kitchens empty, the food rotting on the tables. They found the bedchambers in disarray, the silk sheets torn by frantic hands. But the house was deserted. It was the cold that led them, a draught that flowed like a river of ice through the stagnant heat of the house, pulling them toward the rear, toward the heavy oak door that led to the undercroft. The door stood open, swaying slightly in the draught, creaking a rhythmic warning. Tariq took a torch from one of his men, the flame flickering wildly in the updraft, and signaled for 2 guards to follow him. They descended the stone stairs, the cold intensifying with every step until their breath misted in the air, a fog of life intruding into a domain of death. The silence here was absolute, a vacuum that swallowed the sound of their sandals, amplifying the pounding of their own hearts. At the bottom of the stairs, the laboratory of Al-Jaiz lay revealed in the wavering torchlight, a cavern of shadows and broken dreams. The floor was a treacherous slurry of spilled rosewater, vinegar, and the dust of smashed masonry. In the center of the room, amidst the wreckage of his own making, lay Al-Jaiz. He was not merely dead, he was a monument to the moment of his passing. He lay on his back, his body contorted in a spasm of rigor that must have seized him the instant his heart failed. His hands were clawed, the fingers rigid and hooked as if trying to ward off an invisible blow. But it was his face that made the veteran captain recoil, his breath hissing through his teeth. Al-Jaiz's eyes were wide open, bulging from their sockets, the whites entirely visible, frozen in a stare of such absolute, mind-shattering terror that it seemed to burn an image into the air above him. His mouth was open in a silent scream, the jaw locked so wide it seemed the bone might have snapped, his tongue black and swollen. He did not look like a man who had died of a seizure or a stroke, he looked like a man who had seen the face of the infinite and had been unmade by the sight. There was no mark of violence on him, no knife wound, no bruise, only the internal violence of a fear so potent it had stopped his life in mid-beat. Tariq signaled for the physician to examine the body, though he knew it was a formality, and turned his gaze to the object that had fixed the dead man's stare. The wall. The great retaining wall at the far end of the cellar had been breached. A ragged hole, perhaps 3 feet wide, gaped in the center, surrounded by a debris field of broken bricks and gray, powdery mortar. The sledgehammer lay where it had fallen, its iron head rusted with what looked like old blood, though it was only the wet dust of the cellar. The captain stepped over the body of the perfumer, his boots crunching on the rubble, and approached the breach. He raised the torch, thrusting it into the darkness of the hole, expecting to find the source of the rumors, a body, a skeleton, the rotting remains of a victim. The light spilled into the cavity, illuminating the space between the double-layered brickwork. It was empty. There was no body. There were no bones. There was not even the dust of a decayed corpse. The space was swept clean, as pristine as a vessel that had never held a drop of water. The floor of the niche was bare stone, dry and cold. Tariq frowned, confusion warring with the dread in his gut. He had seen the madness in Al-Jaiz's eyes, he knew this man had been digging for something. A man does not tear down his own house to find nothing. He leaned closer, squinting against the flickering light, and then he saw it. On the back wall of the niche, on the raw, unpolished stone that had been hidden from the world for 3 years, there was a mark. It was not carved with a chisel, nor painted with ink. It was composed of a fine, velvety black dust, soot, perhaps, or the carbonized ash of something that had been completely, impossibly consumed. But the dust was not scattered at random. It adhered to the stone with a supernatural precision, forming sharp, angular lines that defied the laws of chaos. It was writing. Tariq, who could read the script of the court and the ledger of the barracks, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The script was Kufic, the ancient, geometric calligraphy used for the holy text and the monuments of kings, but it was formed with a fluidity and a perfection that no human hand could replicate. The letters seemed to absorb the light of the torch, pulsing with a dark, negative energy. He began to read, his lips moving silently, his mind struggling to comprehend what his eyes were seeing. The text was a detailed record. It began with a date, the 14th night of the month of Rajab, in the year 252. It continued with a name, Yusuf ibn Ahmed, the adder. It described the weapon, a pestle of bronze, cast in the foundry of Kark. It described the method, a blow to the base of the skull, followed by fire in the furnace of iron. It detailed the concealment, the mixing of ash with the lime of the river, the building of the wall, the silence of the years. Every secret Al-Jaiz had buried, every lie he had told, Every detail he had thought consumed by the flames and hidden by the stone, was written there. The ash of the victim had not disappeared, it had reorganized itself. It had become the ink of its own testimony. The matter of Yusuf had refused to be silenced, transforming from flesh to ash to word. Tariq read on, his heart hammering against his ribs, until he reached the bottom of the inscription. There was no signature of a magistrate, no seal of a caliph. There was only a single attribute, a single name written in letters so large and sharp they seemed to slash the stone itself. It was the name Yusuf had whispered with his dying breath, the name Al-Jaiz had tried to wall out, the name that had waited in the dark for 3 years, watching, recording, knowing. Al-Aleem. The torch sputtered and died, plunging the cellar into darkness, but the image of the name burned on in the captain's retina, a brand of fire in the blackness. In the silence that followed, a silence that felt heavy with judgment, the men of the watch stood paralyzed, surrounding the twisted corpse of the man who thought he could hide from the all-knowing. Above them, the city of Baghdad began to wake, the call to prayer drifting down from the minarets, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, but in the cold cellar, the prayer had already been answered. The wall had spoken, and its verdict was etched in the eternal, indestructible ash of the truth.